I've never been one to believe in these things. I always thought that people who dabble in the occult were just desperate people trying to find meaning in their own frustrations. But after my ex-wife left me, after seeing her moving on with another guy as if I had never existed, something inside me broke. I didn't want to admit it, but the loneliness was killing me. That's how I met Isabella. She was younger, beautiful, and had that mysterious way that made me want to discover more. At first, it felt like a gift from the gods, someone who made me feel wanted again. But it didn't take long to realize that she was never really there. Always distant, always hiding something. I tried to ignore it, pretend that everything was fine, but it was eating away at me. She disappeared for days, answered my messages coldly, and every time I asked, she said she was sorting out some things. One day, drunk and not knowing what else to do, I fell into a conversation with a guy who called himself a spiritual healer. He assured me that he could help me strengthen my connection with Isabella, that she would truly stay with me. The only thing I needed to do was trust him and follow a little ritual. It seems ridiculous to say this now, but at the time, with that emptiness suffocating me, I accepted it. He gave me simple instructions. Some candles, a photo of her, a piece of red fabric, and words that I should repeat before going to sleep. I did everything exactly as he ordered. The next morning, Isabella sent me a message as if nothing had happened. It was the first time in weeks that she seemed genuinely interested in seeing me. We arranged to meet, and when she arrived, she was different. Not in the way I expected, not more affectionate, more passionate, but strange. She smiled a lot, spoke to me as if she were following a script, repeating phrases that I had already heard before. Her gestures were precise, mechanical, as if someone had taught her how to act. At first, I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head. Maybe it was just the relief of having her back that made everything seem out of place. But then the nights came. The first time I woke up with her sitting on the edge of the bed, motionless. The room was dark. Only the light from the streetlight outside illuminated her outline. I called her name, but she didn't respond. He just stood there, looking into space, breathing slowly. When I touched her shoulder, she shivered and suddenly lay down again, turning to her side as if nothing had happened. The next day, I asked about it, but she laughed and said she didn't remember anything. "It must have been a dream of yours," she said, but her smile didn't match her eyes. There was something there, something that sent a shiver running up my spine. On the second night, I woke up to a strange noise. It was like a whisper, but not just anyone. It was Isabella. She was lying next to me, her eyes closed, but her lips were moving quickly, murmuring something I couldn't understand. I remained still, trying to decipher what she was saying, but her voice was low, almost drowned out by the sound of the fan. That's when, suddenly, she stopped. The silence in the room became heavy, suffocating. Then, without warning, she opened her eyes. It just didn't look like her. He didn't blink, he didn't show anything. He just looked straight at me, expressionless. I was so scared that I shook his shoulder, calling his name. And as if someone had flipped a switch, she simply smiled and said, "What's wrong?" As if nothing had happened. After that, things got worse. Isabella began to have horrible nightmares. In the middle of the night, she would wake up screaming, her eyes wide with pure terror, as if she had seen something she shouldn't have. More than once, she told me that she felt eyes on her while she slept. I tried to calm her down, saying they were just dreams, but deep down I knew something was wrong. One night, while she was sleeping. I heard a noise coming from the hallway. It was a low sound, a crunch, as if the ground was being stepped on. I got up slowly, opened the bedroom door, and looked into the dark hallway. Nothing. But when I went back to bed, Isabella was awake, her eyes wide. "Did you hear it too?" she whispered. I froze. The way she spoke, the low tone of voice, as if she was afraid of being heard, it gave me butterflies in my stomach. I shook my head, trying to appear calm, and said it must just be the noise from the building, wood creaking or something. But she didn't seem convinced. He stared at the open bedroom door for a while until he finally rolled over and tried to sleep. I lay awake, listening to the heavy silence around us, with that strange feeling that we weren't alone in the apartment. The following night, Isabella had an episode of sleep paralysis. I woke up to the sound of her breathing, rapid and ragged, as if she was suffocating. I turned around and saw that she was lying, on her back, her eyes open but not blinking. The worst thing was the way her mouth moved, as if she was trying to say something without being able to make a sound. I turned on the light and shook her shoulder, trying to wake her up, but she was still there, motionless, her eyes fixed somewhere on the ceiling. It was the longest seconds of my life until, out of nowhere, she sucked in a sharp breath and sat up, shaking. "He was here," she said, without looking at me. He was looking at me. I felt a shiver go up my spine when she said that. I asked who he was, but Isabella just shook her head, her eyes full of fear. "I don't know," she murmured, "but he was right here." I looked around the room, trying not to look as scared as I felt. There was nothing there, but the air felt heavier, suffocating. I wanted to say it was just a nightmare, that these things happen, but my own voice would sound false. Something had been wrong since I did that damn ritual, and now I knew it wasn't just in my head. After that night, Isabella began to change. It wasn't just fear, it was something deeper. During the day, she seemed to be present, but at the same time, distant. She spoke little, avoided eye contact, and spent long minutes standing still, as if she were listening to something I couldn't hear. Sometimes I would find her staring at the corners of the apartment, as if there was something there. When I asked, she just smiled emotionlessly and said, "Nothing." But then, the last night, we were together, I woke up to her whispering again. Only this time, it wasn't an incoherent mumble. She said my name over and over again, no emotion, non-stop. I froze, feeling my name being repeated in that low, emotionless voice. My heart raced. She was lying on her back, looking at the ceiling, her lips moving slowly, as if she were trapped in a trance. "Isabella?" My voice was weaker than I wanted. Nothing. She continued whispering my name, without blinking, without reacting. I touched her arm, and in that instant, she stopped. Absolute silence. Then slowly he turned his head towards me and looked at me. But it wasn't a normal look. It was as if something inside her was watching me through those eyes. My blood ran cold. I jumped out of bed, turned on the light, and shook her, trying to make her come to her senses. She blinked a few times and suddenly started crying. "He was here again," she said, sobbing. "He was in the room." I looked around, but of course there was no one. Still, the feeling that something was there wouldn't leave me. She grabbed my arm tightly and begged me not to turn off the light. I didn't sleep that night. Neither does she. We sat on the bed, waiting for dawn, saying nothing. Deep down, I knew this was all my fault. And the worst? I had no idea how to fix what I had done. The next morning, Isabella left. He didn't say anything. He didn't apologize. He didn't look back. She simply took her things and left. I tried calling, sending a message, but I never heard back. She disappeared from my life the same way she appeared. At first, I thought it was the end of the story, that everything had ended with it. But I was wrong. Because even after she was gone, the feeling that I wasn't alone never went away. In the following weeks, I woke up several times in the middle of the night, with that same tightness in my chest, as if there was someone in the room with me. Sometimes I thought I heard my name being whispered in the silence, the same way Isabella did. Other times I would wake up suddenly, my heart racing for no apparent reason, just with irrational terror. The apartment became colder, emptier, in an unnatural way. And then one night I saw it. I was lying down, almost falling asleep, when I felt a strange weight on me. My body went still. I tried to move, but I couldn't. My heart was beating so hard I thought it was going to explode in my chest. Then my eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I saw a shadow. In the corner of the room, stopped, observing. It was tall, very tall, and it had no face, just a dark, dense presence that seemed to feed on fear. I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't come out. Time stopped. I don't know how long I stayed there, looking at that thing without being able to move, without being able to do anything. And then, out of nowhere, it was over. My body unlocked, the shadow was no longer there, and the room looked exactly the same. But I knew it was still with me. Since that night, I no longer sleep in the dark. I don't know what it brought into my life, but I feel like I will never truly be alone again. When I moved into that apartment, I thought I got a great deal. The rent was cheap, the location was good, and despite being an old building, it seemed well maintained. Most of the residents were elderly, which meant less noise, less confusion. After the breakup with my ex, all I wanted was a peaceful place to start over. And for a few weeks, that was exactly it. But, little by little, I started to notice strange things, small details that at first I tried to ignore. The elevator, for example. Whenever I called him, he would stop at the 9th floor before going down, even if no one had pressed the button. At first, I thought it was just a defect, something like an old building. But then came the noises. Every night, around 2 or 3 in the morning, I would hear sounds coming from the walls and ventilation duct. It wasn't the normal creaking of an ancient structure. It was something different. Shuffling footsteps, as if someone was walking barefoot down the hallway, even when I knew there was no one there. Sometimes the sound seemed to come from inside the walls, muffled, distant, but still clear enough to keep me awake. I asked the doorman if he had noticed anything strange yet. He just shrugged his shoulders and said it was a thing about the age of the building. But the way he looked away bothered me, as if he knew something he didn't want to say. That night, the noises were louder. I tried to ignore it. I put on headphones, turned up the volume on the TV, but nothing seemed to drown out the sound. It wasn't just footsteps, there was something more, a kind of murmur, low, almost indistinguishable, as if someone was crying. I didn't know which apartment it came from, but it seemed close, maybe next door, or just above mine. When the crying became more audible, my curiosity grew louder. I grabbed a flashlight and went into the hallway. The building was silent, except for the muffled sound coming from one of the 9th floor apartments. The 904. I stopped in front of the door and hesitated. The sound was still there, a continuous wail, almost like a choked sob. I didn't want to upset anyone, but something about that crying felt wrong. I took a deep breath and knocked. Once. Two. Is anyone there? My voice sounded low, but in the silence of the hallway, it echoed more than I expected. No response. Just the same crying. It was then that the door, without anyone unlocking it, began to open on its own. Slowly, squeaking as if it had never been lubricated, cold air escaped the dark interior of the apartment, bringing with it a strange smell. Damp, mold, and worse, something rotten. My entire body tensed. I should have turned around at that moment, but I stayed there, standing still, looking at the darkness inside apartment 904. The only thing that moved was the cold air coming out from inside, filled with that rotten, sickening smell. The crying had stopped. That was what bothered me the most. A second before, I was sure someone was crying, inside, and now, absolute silence. I took a step forward, illuminating the interior with my cell phone's flashlight. The floor was covered in dust and the apartment seemed completely empty. No furniture, no signs that anyone lived there. Just a dark, abandoned space. I swallowed hard and took another step, trying to understand what I was seeing. The cell phone light shook in my hand. There were stains on the floor, dark, spread across the wooden floor, dry, impregnated stains. My chest
tightened. Blood, or something very similar to that. Then something moved in the corner of the apartment. My breathing caught. The flashlight quickly illuminated the far wall, and for a split second, I swear, I saw a shadow shrink out of the light, as if running away. My instinct screamed at me to get out of there, but before I could move, I heard breathing. Not mine, not from anyone nearby. It was deep, low, coming from inside the apartment, coming from all sides at once. I felt my entire body
freeze. That didn't make sense. The apartment was empty. I had seen it with my own eyes. But that breath, it was real. Heavy, deep, like something was hiding in the darkness, just watching me. My fingers grew sweaty around the phone as I tried to focus the flashlight on each corner, but all I saw were shadows. The smell in the air grew stronger, almost unbearable. And then, before I could react, the door behind me started to close. It was slow at first, creaking in the suffocating silence. My
heart raced. I took a step back, but at that moment, I heard it. A whisper right next to me, low, drawn out, and completely beyond any logic. "Do you see now?" I didn't think. I didn't try to understand. I simply turned and ran. I pushed the door before it closed completely and practically threw myself out of the apartment. My foot slipped on the hallway floor, but I kept running without looking back, without breathing properly. I didn't stop until I was inside my apartment, with the door locked and all the lights on. My chest rose and fell uncontrollably, and a single question kept ringing in my head. What the hell was inside that place? I spent the rest of the night sitting on the couch with all the lights on, trying to convince myself that it hadn't happened the way I remembered it. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks. Maybe the sound of crying came from another apartment and my imagination did the rest. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't erase the
feeling that stuck with me, the rotten smell, the suffocating cold, and most importantly, that voice. Do you see now? The next day, I took courage and went to talk to the doorman again. This time, I went straight. I asked about apartment 904. The old man looked at me for a few seconds, as if he was deciding whether or not he should tell me something. Finally, he let out a heavy sigh. "This apartment has been empty for years," he said. Since the last resident disappeared." I frowned. "Gone?" I repeated, waiting for him to continue. But he just shook his head and looked back at the small TV in the lobby, as if the conversation had ended there. I wanted to insist, but something in his manner made me give up. That was bouncing around in my head all day. It disappeared. How did it disappear? I tried to look for something about the building on the internet, but I didn't find anything relevant. No news, no strange stories. It seemed like apartment 904 simply didn't exist to the rest of the world, but I knew what I had seen, what I had heard, whatever was in there, it was still there. And I felt like now I knew I was too. That night, I did everything I could to not think about it. I put on headphones and watched videos on my cell phone until my eyes burned with sleep. But around 3 in the morning, something woke me up. The apartment was plunged into silence, but I felt it before I even heard it. A shiver ran down the back of my neck. The air seemed heavier, charged. Then came the noise. 3 knocks on my door, draughts, strong. I froze. My apartment was at the end of the corridor. No one ever came by at that time. I held my breath, hoping it was just a neighbor, but the silence returned. I waited a few minutes, trying to work up the courage to look through the peephole. When I finally got up and walked to the door, my heart hammering in my chest, I looked outside. The hallway was empty, but the elevator was stopped at 9th floor. My blood ran cold. The elevator always did this, stopping on the 9th floor for no reason. But that night, after the knock on my door, it seemed like more than just a defect. It felt like a warning, or worse, an invitation. I stood there, standing in the doorway, trying to decide whether to go back to bed and pretend nothing had happened, or whether to face this situation once and for all. Deep down, I knew I was past the point of ignoring. I was already involved in this. So, before I could change my mind, I grabbed my cell phone, opened the door, and walked to the elevator. The hallway was cold, much colder than it should be at that time of year. Each step echoed on the tiles, and my heart seemed to beat in time with my steps. When I pressed the button to call the elevator, the lights on the dashboard flickered for a second before stabilizing. The door opened with a long metallic creak. The inside was dark. Not quite. A dim light flickered from the ceiling, flickering from time to time, creating shadows that seemed to move on their own. I walked in hesitantly and pressed the button for the 9th floor. The doors closed and the elevator began to rise. Each floor the elevator passed, my anxiety increased. The air inside felt heavier, like it was thick, with something I couldn't see but could feel. The digital display showed 7th floor, 8th, and then, when he arrived at 9th, the elevator stopped with a sudden jolt. The lights blinked twice before stabilizing. The silence was absolute. I hesitated before leaving. My fingers were sweaty, my chest was rising and falling too quickly. But then the doors began to open, and the 9th floor corridor revealed itself before me. The first thing I noticed was the smell. That same smell as in apartment 904, only worse, more intense, almost impossible to bear. The hallway was dark, only one of the lamps flickering at the end, casting warped shadows on the walls. My stomach turned, and for a moment I thought about going back, pressing any other button and getting out of there as quickly as possible. But it was then that I noticed something. The door of 904, it was open. Not wide open, but open enough for me to see a sliver of the dark interior. And then, without warning, something moved inside. My entire body seized up. I saw movement, quick, low, as if something had crawled across the floor or moved from one room to another within the apartment. My instinct screamed at me to get out of there, but my legs wouldn't
move. The silence was suffocating. The putrid smell seemed to stick in my throat. And then the sound came. It was a sharp crack, like wood breaking, then a scratch, like nails scraping the floor. My eyes were fixed on the door opening, waiting for something, anything. My heart was beating so hard I could hear the blood pounding in my ears. Then slowly, 904's door began to open wider. Alone. Every inch revealed a little more of the dark apartment, until finally I saw it. The hallway light
Flickered on just in time, and for a split second everything went dark. When he came back, I saw it. Something was standing inside. At the back of the apartment, near the wall, there was a silhouette. Tall, thin, completely still. I couldn't see details, just a distorted outline, as if the shadow didn't belong to the environment. My breathing hitched. It didn't move, but I felt like it was looking right at me. An irrational terror gripped my body and my mind screamed at me to run. But it was when the light flashed again that everything came crashing down. In shadow, moved. It didn't go, it didn't make any noise, she simply moved. A second ago she was leaning against the wall. The next moment he was much closer to the door. I felt an absurd cold take over me, as if I had been doused in ice-cold water. My chest tightened and my vision blurred for a moment. I didn't know if it was really getting closer to me or if my mind was betraying me, but I didn't wait to find out. I turned and
ran. I ran down the corridor without looking back. I desperately pressed the elevator button, but it wouldn't go down. It didn't come down. The panel continued to mark the 9th floor, as if he were trapped there with me. Without thinking, I ran to the stairs. I went down the steps 3 at a time, stumbling, hitting the banister, but not stopping. Only when I reached my floor, almost out of breath, did I realize that the feeling of cold was still with me. I opened the door to my apartment with
shaking hands and slammed it behind me. I threw myself on the floor, trying to catch my breath, my heart racing in my chest. I was safe. It had to be safe. But then I saw my cell phone still in my hand. The flashlight was still on, and the screen showed the last open application. The camera, with the last photo taken, and in the reflection of the mirror in the 9th floor corridor, the shadow was still there.